The coroner's report read, "Victim, male, 40 years old." That man was Chris Penn. He was found alone, motionless in his Santa Monica condo. The official cause, nonspecific cardiomyopathy. It was a cold medical term, hiding the raw truth of a lethal combination of prescription drugs and a heart that had exhausted itself fighting a lonely battle. It was a tragic end for Penn's little brother. But before that, Chris Penn was the real deal on screen. His magic was his wildness. He wasn't just Sean Penn's little brother. He was his own force, a ruthless, nice guy Eddie you couldn't forget. He had the best launch pad imaginable, God-given talent, and the Penn name. This was supposed to be a brilliant success story. So why did that red-carpeted path lead him straight into a dead end? Born on October 10th, 1965 in Los Angeles, California, Christopher was the youngest of three boys, born into a Hollywood dynasty. His father was Leo Penn, a talented actor whose career was derailed by the McCarthy-era blacklist. Refusing to name names, he pivoted to become a prolific and successful television director. His mother was Eileen Ryan, a versatile actress with a career spanning over 6 decades. The Penn household wasn't one of shallow celebrity, but was built on craft, integrity, and resilience. Art was the family business. Into this creative, complex, and passionate home came 3 sons. Michael, the eldest, who found his voice in music. Sean, the intense middle child destined for superstardom. And Chris, the youngest, the one with the easy smile. Growing up, he wasn't just Chris. He was inevitably Sean's little brother, a label that would challenge him throughout his life. Acting wasn't a distant dream. It was the expected path. The family trade he entered almost immediately. Chris Penn didn't wait to be discovered. At the tender age of 12, he enrolled at the Loft Studio in Los Angeles, a serious professional training ground founded by renowned method acting coach Peggy Fury, who, like his father Leo, had studied directly with Lee Strasberg. Thrown into a world of adult actors, Chris began his apprenticeship, learning that acting was about finding emotional truth. His classmates included other future stars like Johnny Depp and Nicolas Cage. His days were spent at Santa Monica High School, but his true education continued at the Loft Studio and within his social circle. His best friends were other kids from acting families or with similar ambitions: Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, and Charlie Sheen. Long before they were dubbed the Brat Pack, they were teenagers making their own Super 8 movies in the neighborhood. Lowe later recalled Chris as the spirit of filmmaking for their group, more fascinated by the process, the camera, the storytelling, the collaboration, than just stardom, a trait echoing his director father. The drive to work professionally was intense. After just 2 years, Chris dropped out of high school, not as an act of rebellion but as a vocational choice. His apprenticeship was complete. Acting was now his full-time profession. His first screen appearance came in 1979 at age 14 in the obscure Charlie and the Talking Buzzard. The real ignition point was 1983. At 18, Chris landed 3 key roles. First, a supporting part in Francis Ford Coppola's experimental Rumblefish, alongside Matt Dillon and Nicolas Cage. Though a box office bomb, it gave him artistic credibility. He was working with a master. Second, he played the loyal best friend to Tom Cruise in the mainstream hit All the Right Moves, establishing his reliable screen presence. Most significantly, 1983 saw him write, direct, produce, and star in his own short film, Nobody's Heroes. Self-financed and supported by donations from Vietnam veterans, this war drama revealed his deeper ambition to be a filmmaker, a craftsman in his own right, just like his father Leo. He had proven his talent, pedigree, and ambition. Now, he was about to become a household name. By the end of 1983, Chris Penn had done exactly what he set out to do: prove he was more than just Sean's brother. He had artistic credibility from Rumblefish, commercial appeal from All the Right Moves, and the creative ambition of a true filmmaker with nobody's heroes. He was a 19-year-old craftsman ready for a serious career, but his next role wouldn't just be serious, it would be a pop culture explosion. A script was circulating that would transform him from a respected young actor into a household name, creating a beloved character that would become both a blessing and a burden. In 1984, that next step would come in the form of a script that would define his life, creating a beloved cultural icon, and, in the process, a golden cage. The film was Footloose. The project was already one of the most anticipated films in Hollywood. Its screenwriter, Dean Pitchford, was a phenomenon, having just won an Oscar for writing the title song for the 1980 film Fame. Now, Pitchford was making his screenwriting debut with a story loosely based on real events in Elmore City, Oklahoma, about a town that had banned dancing. It was a high-stakes musical drama, and the studio, Paramount Pictures, was pouring a significant $8.2 million budget into it. The casting process was a gauntlet. For the lead role of Ren McCormack, the studio was considering superstars like Tom Cruise and Rob Lowe. The director, Herbert Ross, was a Hollywood heavyweight known for directing hits like The Goodbye Girl and Steel Magnolias. This was the big leagues. In the script, the character of Willard Huitt was written as a handsome jock football player. He was the quintessential good-looking all-American best friend. On paper, Chris Penn, with his bull in a china shop energy, was the opposite of what was written. But the film's casting director, Marcy Liroff, had just cast Penn in All the Right Moves and had been captivated by his raw, unpolished, and completely authentic presence. She saw something in him that wasn't on the page. Liroff begged a skeptical Herbert Ross to let Penn audition. As she later recalled, Ross was resistant, as Penn was nothing like the character as written. But she persisted, and Penn, in a move of either pure confidence or youthful arrogance, showed up for the audition and, according to Liroff, didn't even bother to look at his script until rehearsal day. It didn't matter. Liroff said she didn't even need to see Penn act to know he was the one. The moment he walked in the room, his chaotic, lovable, and vulnerable energy was so magnetic that Ross and Pitchford saw the flaw in their own script. This was Willard. In a move almost unheard of for a major studio production, they didn't just cast Penn, they threw out the old character and rewrote the part entirely to fit him. The handsome jock was gone. In his place was a loyal, slightly backward, affable, and tough kid who was hiding a secret. He couldn't dance. This change was not just a tweak. It was a narrative masterstroke that would give the film its comedic and emotional heart. Footloose began filming in Utah, and Penn's natural, unforced charm immediately created the chemistry that would anchor the film. His friendship with his co-star, Kevin Bacon, was not just for the cameras. Bacon, in the high-pressure lead role, found an easygoing ally in Penn. Decades later, on the Remembering Willard DVD featurette, Bacon would recall their time on set with a palpable fondness, describing Penn as a dude he loved playing around with and who always made me laugh. Sarah Jessica Parker, who played Willard's love interest, Rusty, echoed the sentiment, remembering his infectious energy. This authenticity, however, presented a major technical problem. When Dean Pitchford rewrote the role for the non-dancer Penn, he added the Willard can't dance subplot for comedic effect, but it was not an act. Chris Penn, the 19-year-old actor, genuinely could not dance a lick. This became a crisis when it came time to film the movie's most iconic sequence, the training montage. The scene called for Wren, Bacon, to teach Willard Penn how to find his rhythm. The film's choreographer, Lynn Taylor Corbett, was brought in to solve the problem. She found Penn to be a block of pure resistance, clumsy, embarrassed, and completely out of his element. Taylor Corbett, a Tony-nominated professional, was stumped. No amount of traditional 1 and 2 in instruction worked. Finally, she had a breakthrough. She asked Penn what he was passionate about. He lit up talking about his hobbies, wrestling and martial arts. This was the key. As Taylor Corbett later explained, she threw out the dance terminology and equated it to wrestling. She choreographed the scene not as a dance, but as a series of drills and athletic maneuvers. The awkward foot shuffling, the lunging, the flailing, it was all choreographed chaos, rooted in a physical language Penn understood. The result was pure cinematic magic. The scene was originally filmed to the much slower, more melancholy Carla Bonoff song, Somebody's Eyes. When director Herbert Ross cut the scene together, he knew it was a disaster. The footage of Penn's joyous, triumphant, and hilarious movements was completely mismatched with the down-tempo song. A new song had to be written, and fast. Dean Pitchford and his co-writer, Tom Snow, were tasked with writing an upbeat track to match the energy of Penn's performance. They built the entire song around the line, "Let's hear it for the boy." Denise Williams was flown in to record it, and the new track was slotted into the film. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The sequence, a perfect fusion of Penn's comedic vulnerability, Bacon's earnest friendship, and a killer pop song, became the film's standout moment. Years later, Bacon himself would state that this montage, not his own famous warehouse solo, was the best dance scene in the movie. Footloose was released on February 17, 1984, and it was a cultural earthquake. It exploded at the box office, grossing over $80 million on its $8.2 million budget, making it the 7th biggest film of the year. Its soundtrack was inescapable, spawning 2 number-1 hits, including Let's Hear It for the Boy, which, along with the title track, was nominated for an Academy Award. Overnight, Chris Penn became one of the most recognizable young actors in America. He was Willard. His performance was the definition of a scene stealer. He was the audience's surrogate, the lovable, loyal friend everyone wished they had. He was the film's soul. But in the halls of critical opinion, the story was different. The movie itself received mixed to negative reviews from the nation's top critics. The New York Times and Variety focused their praise on Kevin Bacon and John Lithgow. Roger Ebert, in his scathing 2-star review, called the film seriously confused and a collection of unrelated ingredients, meticulously breaking down the performances of Bacon and Lithgow, but failing to mention Chris Penn or the Willard character even once. This was the birth of the central paradox of Chris Penn's career. He was a massive pop culture icon who was simultaneously invisible to the critical establishment. He was adored by the public, but overlooked by the arbiters of serious acting. For Penn, a 19-year-old actor who defined himself as a craftsman from the lineage of Leo Penn and the Actors Studio, this was a problem. He didn't want to be a lovable sidekick. He wanted to be a respected artist. He was his father's son, and he immediately and aggressively pivoted. His very next film, released just 7 months after Footloose in September 1984, was The Wild Life. On paper, it was the perfect move. The film was written by Cameron Crowe, the new voice of the generation, and it was being marketed as a spiritual sequel to Fast Times at Ridgemont High. The film that had made his brother Sean a star. This was Chris's chance to have his own Fast Times, to be the rebellious, edgy lead. Once again, the role was shaped by Penn's real-life persona. Cameron Crowe recalled that he was struggling to find an actor for the lead role of the selfish stud slacker Tom Drake. He was unable to find anyone who was as colorful as Christopher Penn and decided to interview him just to understand the mentality. Penn, true to form, walked in an hour late in fatigues with Jimi Hendrix music blaring from his tape machine. Crowe was so taken by this raw, chaotic energy that the interview helped him to formulate the final character. Penn was cast as the lead, the star. The film was the anti-Footloose. His character Tom Drake was described by critics as a deeply unlikable jerk, a ne'er-well hooligan, and an insufferable bad boy party animal. Where Willard was all heart, Drake was all selfish impulse. The gamble failed. The wildlife was a critical and commercial bomb. It was panned as entirely plotless and a weak imitation of Fast Times. One review bluntly stated, "Chris Penn cannot carry a lead actor spot." The film that was meant to be his star vehicle had crashed and burned. He had successfully proven he wasn't Willard, but in the process, he had proven he wasn't a leading man either. Undeterred, Penn pivoted again, this time even harder. If he couldn't be the star, he would be the villain. In 1985, he took a role in Pale Rider, a major Western directed by and starring the icon Clint Eastwood. Penn was cast as Josh LaHood, the cruel, arrogant, and slimy son of the film's main antagonist. He was mean, he was effective, and he was the furthest one could get from the boy who danced to Let's Hear It for the Boy. This time, the pivot worked. Pale Rider was a critical and box office hit, becoming one of the highest-grossing westerns of the decade. Roger Ebert, who had completely ignored Penn in Footloose, gave Pale Rider a perfect 4-star review. While Ebert's praise focused on Eastwood, other critics finally took note of Penn's range. The Ultimate Rabbit praised his terrific work as a slimy and underhanded villain. In 1986, he made the project that seemed inevitable. He worked with his family. At Close Range starred his brother Sean in a dark, gritty, true crime story about a rural crime family. Chris played Tommy, the brother to Sean's lead. Their mother, Eileen Ryan, played their on-screen grandmother. The film was powerful, disturbing, and critically acclaimed. It cemented a new specialty for Chris, the heavy, the gangster. The role was a chilling preview of the path his career would one day take. Penn had successfully navigated the first great challenge of his career, escaping the golden cage of Willard. By aggressively pivoting to dark, villainous roles in Pale Rider and At Close Range, he proved his range and his commitment to the family craft. His public career was a study in professional discipline, but this very discipline was about to be tested in his private life. As he secretly mastered the physical control of martial arts, he was about to face an emotional tidal wave so devastating it would tear his life apart, creating a deep, contradictory fault line between the man who was a focused black belt and the man who was hopelessly grieving. As the 1980s progressed, Chris Penn had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of teen stardom. He had survived the cultural explosion of Footloose by refusing to be typecast, pivoting from the lovable Willard to the loathsome Josh LaHood in Pale Rider and the gritty, doomed Tommy Whitewood in At Close Range. He had established himself as a versatile and serious character actor, a true craftsman in the mold of his father, Leo. But as his public career solidified, Chris was nurturing a private, parallel life, one defined by an intense, almost spiritual devotion to an opposing set of principles. While his brother Sean was famous for his brawls with paparazzi, Chris was channeling his physical energy into a pursuit of pure discipline. This was not a Hollywood hobby, like a spin class or a trendy diet. Chris Penn was a serious, dedicated, and lifelong martial artist. He trained in kickboxing under one of the most formidable fighters on the planet, the legendary Don the Dragon Wilson, arguably the greatest kickboxing champion of all time. This was not a celebrity vanity project. Penn immersed himself in the craft, dedicating himself to the grueling, repetitive, and ego-stripping work required to master the art. He eventually earned a black belt in karate. This pursuit was the core contradiction of his life. Here was a man born into a world of artistic impulse and emotional volatility, who was privately drawn to a philosophy of absolute physical and mental control. He understood discipline. He understood focus. He understood the mastery of one's own body. This discipline, this focus, this hard-won physical control, it stands in heartbreaking, almost unimaginable contrast to the war he was fighting off-screen. Around this time in the late 1980s, Chris Penn's personal life was struck by a tragedy so profound it would alter the course of his entire life. He and his girlfriend had a child. It was a daughter. She was born prematurely, and her lungs were too weak. She lived for just 2 days before she passed away. We cannot know the depth of that kind of grief. For any parent, it is a wound that defies comprehension. For Chris, it was a black hole. It was a gravitational pull of despair that consumed every part of his being, his discipline, his ambition, and his craft. The grief was the trigger. The man who had trained his body to obey him now found himself in the grips of an impulse he could not or would not control. He began a full-blown addiction to cocaine. He was, for a time, brutally honest about this period. In a remarkably candid 1996 interview with The Independent, long after he had gotten clean, he refused to hide behind euphemism or self-pity. He confronted his own choices head-on. "It happened gradually," he told the reporter. "I started to play around with it a little bit, and then I had a tragedy happen. I lost a daughter. I went kind of overboard. I just used it as an excuse to do as many drugs as I could." His words are haunting in their self-awareness. I just used it as an excuse. He wasn't blaming his grief. He was blaming his reaction to it. He continued, "It took me a year or so to figure out what I was doing, and by then I was completely addicted." The disciplined martial artist was now at war with the grieving addict, and the addict was winning. His career, once so bright, began to stall and then to nosedive. The late 1980s and early 1990s became a wilderness of forgettable roles in films that were far beneath his talent. He was no longer the promising young craftsman from Rumble Fish. He was no longer the cultural icon from Footloose. He was becoming a liability. The phone wasn't ringing the way it used to. The scripts were bad. He was gaining weight. He was drifting. The industry that had celebrated his arrival now saw him as a risk, as unstable. The easy charm of Willard Huitt was gone, replaced by the volatile reputation of an addict who had lost his way. This era is defined by a string of what The Guardian would later call movie stinkers, films that were either critical bombs, commercial failures, or both. In 1989, he appeared in Return from the River Kwai. Despite its prestigious-sounding title, the film was an unconnected, low-budget sequel to the 1957 classic The Bridge on the River Kwai. It was a box office disaster, so poorly received that it barely registered a release. That same year, he starred in the martial arts film Best of the Best. It was a chance to finally show off the skills he had spent years honing. He played Travis Brickley, a cocky bar-fighting martial artist who joins the U.S. Taekwondo team. While the film would later gain a cult following, it was a modest B-movie action flick. And his performance, though physically impressive, was overshadowed by the film's sports movie cliches. Then in 1991 came a pair of films that marked the absolute nadir. The first was Future Kick, a direct-to-video science fiction action movie where he starred opposite his own sensei, Don the Dragon Wilson. Penn played a cyberpunk bounty hunter, and the film was a cheap, forgettable artifact of the VHS bargain bin. The second and most high-profile failure was Mobsters. This was a major studio picture, a glossy attempt to create a Brat Pack version of The Godfather, starring Christian Slater as Lucky Luciano and Patrick Dempsey as Meyer Lansky. Penn was cast as the gangster Tommy Reyna. The film was an unmitigated catastrophe, savaged by critics as an embarrassing, shallow, and ludicrously bad imitation of a superior genre. Roger Ebert gave it 1 star. It was a professional humiliation for everyone involved. In the span of 5 years, Chris Penn had gone from starring in Footloose, the 7th highest-grossing film of 1984, to co-starring in Mobsters, one of the most ridiculed films of 1991. He was in his late 20s. He was an addict. He was grieving. And his career was, for all intents and purposes, over. The man who had been Willard was now a ghost, haunting the bargain bins of video stores. The late 80s and early 90s were a wilderness of personal grief and professional humiliation. The disciplined black belt had lost the war to the addict. By 1991, following the critical disasters of Mobsters and Future Kick, Chris Penn was 26 years old, and by all Hollywood metrics, finished. He was a liability, a risk, a tragic what if. He needed more than a job. He needed a resurrection. That resurrection would come from the most unlikely of saviors, a 28-year-old video store clerk with a brilliant, brutal script and an encyclopedic knowledge of cinema. Chris Penn was at the bottom. He needed a lifeline. He needed a role so raw, so powerful, and so undeniably brilliant that it would force Hollywood to see him again. Not as a washed-up teen star, not as Sean's brother, and not as a liability, but as the formidable world-class actor he was born to be. That lifeline came in the form of a script from a first-time director, a video store clerk named Quentin Tarantino. The film was Reservoir Dogs. Penn knew this was his last shot. He would later say, "I was at the bottom. I needed Reservoir Dogs." He went into that audition and poured every ounce of his frustration, his craft, his anger, and his desperation into the room. The role he was reading for was nice guy Eddie Cabot, the boss's son. He was up against a field of other actors, but Penn's raw, manic, and yet somehow endearing energy was precisely what Tarantino was looking for. He didn't just get the part, he was the part. From the very first scene, Penn is electric. The film opens in a diner with a now legendary debate about the meaning of Madonna's Like a Virgin. Penn, holding his own in a room of acting titans, Harvey Keitel, Steve Buscemi, Michael Madsen, and the notoriously volatile Lawrence Tierney, is a whirlwind of arrogant motor-mouthed confidence. He is the boss's son, and he has an easy, unearned authority that he wears like a second skin. The entire look of the character was Chris's own creation. The film, shot on a shoestring budget of $1.5 million, had almost no money for a costume department. Many of the actors wore their own clothes. The iconic black suits were provided free by the designer, but nice guy Eddie wasn't part of the color-coded heist crew. Penn showed up to set with his own wardrobe. That iconic, garish blue and orange tracksuit? It was Chris Penn's. That choice perfectly captured the character's blend of suburban comfort and gangster entitlement. He was a guy who was so secure in his position, he didn't need to wear a suit to the office. On set, the atmosphere was a powder keg. The veteran actor Lawrence Tierney, playing his father Joe Cabot, was famously difficult, and according to Tarantino, a complete lunatic. He and Tarantino got into a shoving match the first week, and Tarantino fired him, only to be forced to rehire him. Penn, as his on-screen son, had to navigate this chaos, acting out a loving, loyal father-son relationship with a man who was actively antagonizing the rest of the cast. This tension only added to the frantic, holding it all together energy of his performance. Throughout the film, Penn is the frantic, loyal son trying to manage a catastrophic situation. He's not just a thug, he's the one who genuinely cares. He has a tangible, loving relationship with his father, Joe, and a fierce, protective loyalty to his childhood friend, Mr. Blonde, Michael Madsen. And then the climax, the final bloody, chaotic Mexican standoff. When nice guy Eddie bursts into the warehouse and sees the carnage, his face is a novel of pure emotion. He sees his father is dead. He sees his friend, Mr. Blonde, is dead. He executes the captured cop, Marvin Nash, without a second thought. And then he turns to Tim Roth's Mr. Orange, the man he suspects is the rat, and demands the truth. The look on his face in that moment, the rage, the grief, the confusion, the betrayal, was described by one critic as the most horrified stare in cinematic history. It is a performance of pure, explosive, reactive honesty. In a film built on postmodern, cool and stylized dialogue, Chris Penn provided the raw, bleeding, and terrified heart. Reservoir Dogs, released in 1992, was a cultural earthquake. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and became the definitive independent film of the 1990s. And just like that, Chris Penn was back. He wasn't just back. He was one of the most sought-after and respected character actors in Hollywood. The phone was ringing again. The scripts were good. Quentin Tarantino, now the hottest writer in town, immediately cast him again. The very next year, 1993, Penn appeared in True Romance, which Tarantino wrote and Tony Scott directed. He played Detective Nicky Dimes, a cynical, wisecracking cop. In his scenes, acting opposite Tom Sizemore, Penn is a bundle of frenetic, paranoid energy. His performance was so compelling that on the DVD commentary, Tarantino, a man famous for talking, simply says, "I'm just going to watch for a minute as Penn's scene plays out." That same year, 1993, he secured a role that solidified his return to the world of serious filmmaking. He was cast in Shortcuts, the sprawling 3-hour-plus masterpiece directed by the legendary Robert Altman. The film was a mosaic of interconnected stories based on the work of Raymond Carver. Penn played Jerry Kaiser, a troubled swimming pool cleaner who is deeply disturbed by the fact that his wife, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, works from home as a telephone sex worker. His performance was a masterpiece of quiet, internalized rage. He was a man forced to listen to his wife's graphic, simulated infidelities, a slow-burn pressure cooker of jealousy and humiliation that threatens to explode. Being cast by Altman placed him in an elite ensemble that included Jack Lemmon, Julianne Moore, Robert Downey Jr., and Tim Robbins. The film was a critical sensation, and the entire cast was awarded the prestigious Volpe Cup for Best Ensemble at the Venice Film Festival. Chris Penn, the man who just 2 years earlier was starring in Future Kick with Don the Dragon Wilson, was now an award-winning member of the most celebrated acting ensemble of the year. He was working with the greatest directors of his time. He even had fun showing up as Floyd, a bumbling, over-the-top, and financially motivated villain in the 1993 family comedy Beethoven's Second. His resurrection was complete. He had proven his range, his craft, and his resilience. But his greatest artistic achievement was yet to come. In 1996, he starred in The Funeral, a gritty, independent crime drama from the notorious cult director Abel Ferrara. The film was a dark, philosophical, and brutal story of three brothers in a gangster family in the 1930s New York. His co-stars were the iconic Christopher Walken and the intense Vincent Gallo. Penn played the middle brother, Shea Tempio. This was not nice guy Eddie. This was not Willard. This was the role of his life. Penn's performance as Shay is a terrifying, heartbreaking, and complex portrayal of a man drowning in his own violent impulses. He is the family's hothead, a simmering volcano of rage, but it's a rage born of profound sadness and a desperate, failed search for a moral center. He is a man who commits horrific acts of violence, but is also capable of deep philosophical introspection and crippling self-loathing. It is a terrifying, deeply empathetic, and nuanced performance. For this role, Chris Penn returned to the Venice Film Festival, but this time it wasn't for an ensemble award. This time it was just for him. He won the Volpe Cup for Best Supporting Actor. It was the ultimate validation. This was one of the oldest and most prestigious acting awards on the planet. To put it in perspective, it was an honor his brother Sean would also achieve, winning the Volpe Cup for Best Actor just 1 year later. For one shining, triumphant moment, Chris Penn was not in his brother's shadow. He was not the other Penn. He was standing right beside him on the world stage, an equal, a fellow champion, and a master of his craft. That same year, 1996, he landed a rare leading role in the Canadian independent film The Boys Club, playing a cold-blooded, manipulative killer who terrorizes a group of teenagers. He was at the absolute, undisputed peak of his craft. He had climbed out of the deepest hole in his career to deliver his greatest work. The comeback was complete. In 1996, Chris Penn stood at the absolute summit of his profession. With a Volpe Cup from Venice for the Funeral, he had achieved the one thing he'd craved his entire life: independent, elite validation as a master of his craft. He was no longer in his brother's shadow. He was his equal. He had climbed his mountain. But the peak was a lonely, precarious place. The demons he had wrestled into submission to make his comeback were still there, waiting. And the tragic irony of his life is that his greatest artistic triumph would be immediately followed by a slow, devastating personal decline. The slow decline, a notorious voice, and the unfinished dream. The high of 1996 was impossible to sustain. After a memorable supporting role in the 1998 blockbuster action comedy Rush Hour, the momentum of Chris's career began to slow once again. In Rush Hour, he played Clive Codd, a sleazy, fast-talking arms dealer. His scenes, crackling with a paranoid energy, were a perfect comedic foil for Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan. The film was a massive international hit, but it also helped to solidify a new kind of typecasting for Penn. He was no longer the lovable buddy. He was now the go-to actor to play a cop or a criminal. The nuanced, award-winning roles like Shay Tempio were replaced by serviceable, often cliched parts in less ambitious films. Paper Trail, 1998, as an FBI agent; One Tough Cop, 1998, as a cynical detective; Corky Romano, 2001, as a mafia brother; and Murder by Numbers, 2002, as a fall guy. He was working constantly, but the quality of the work was in a visible, steep decline, and so was his health. The unresolved grief and his struggles with substance abuse, which had plagued him since the death of his daughter, returned with a vengeance. This, combined with a lifestyle of excess, led to a significant and dangerous weight gain. In his 20s, he had been a disciplined, athletic black belt. In his late 30s, he was classified as morbidly obese. At 6 feet tall, he weighed an estimated 310 pounds, 140 kilograms. This wasn't just a personal health crisis, it was a professional one, and he knew it. He expressed deep regret in his later years, acknowledging to friends and in interviews that his size was costing him roles. He knew there were parts he would have been perfect for had he been thinner. The man who had trained his body to be a weapon in martial arts now found himself trapped in a body that was failing him. The industry that had welcomed him back with open arms after Reservoir Dogs could be cruel. In 2001, he was cast in a major, high-profile subplot for the blockbuster sequel American Pie 2. He was set to play the father of the iconic, obnoxious character Steve Stifler, a role that, on paper, seemed perfect for his blend of menace and comedy. It was a chance to return to the mainstream in a huge way. He filmed all of his scenes, but when the movie was shown to test audiences, the entire subplot was deemed ineffective. Director J.B. Rogers later explained that audiences didn't really want an explanation as to why Stifler acts how he does. They'd rather just enjoy it. The studio agreed. His role, his entire performance, was cut from the final film. It was a quiet, professional humiliation, and the footage was relegated to the deleted scenes reel on the DVD. But the talent was still there, undeniable, waiting for a new medium. And in 2004, he found a new, massive, and unexpected audience in a world he'd never explored. He was cast as the voice of Officer Edward Eddie Pulaski in the video game Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Pulaski was a monster. He was a key member of CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, a corrupt, racist, and brutally violent cop who, along with his partner Frank Tenpenny, voiced by Samuel L. Jackson, terrorizes the game's protagonist. Penn's voice work was a revelation. He brought a slimy, snarling, terrifying life to the character. He wasn't just reading lines, he was performing, infusing every word with a lazy, arrogant menace. The game was a global phenomenon, selling tens of millions of copies and becoming one of the most celebrated and iconic video games of all time. A whole new generation knew Chris Penn not as Willard or as nice guy Eddie, but as the most hated and most memorable cop in Los Santos. He continued to work, a true professional, even as his health worsened. He appeared in episodes of CSI Miami Will and Grace, as Rudy, a tour director for Barry Manilow, and a notable 2005 episode of Law & Order, Criminal Intent, Death Row. He even played a version of himself in a 2005 episode of the hit HBO series Entourage. He was always working, always on a set, but he never ever gave up on his true ambition. That 18-year-old kid who had made nobody's heroes was still inside him. For years, he had been working on a new script, a feature-length film about the Vietnam War, based on his 1983 short. This was his passion project. This was the film he believed would finally allow him to step out of the actor box and into the filmmaker role his father, Leo, had mastered. He wasn't just writing it. Friends recalled that he was building the sets himself. He was pouring all of his remaining energy, which was fading fast, into this one last dream. He wanted to be a director. He wanted to finally tell his own story. His friends were worried. He was working himself to the bone, even as his health was visibly failing. He was burning the candle at both ends, and the flame was beginning to flicker. In late January 2006, a small independent film he had a role in, the Darwin Awards, was set to premiere at the prestigious Sundance Film Festival in Utah. It was a moment of validation, a return to the festival that had launched his comeback with Reservoir Dogs 14 years earlier. He died as he had lived, a craftsman obsessed with a project. At just 40 years old, Chris Penn was found dead in his Santa Monica condo, his dream of directing his Vietnam film unrealized. The news hit Hollywood with a brutal shock. The premiere of his new film at Sundance, which should have been a celebration, was suddenly a memorial. Immediately, the media narrative began to form, driven by his public struggles. It was another Hollywood overdose. But the truth, as revealed by the coroner, was far more complex and in many ways more tragic. The story wasn't a simple case of addiction. It was a perfect storm of a life lived hard, a body pushed to its limit, and a heart that simply could not take any more. The shockwave was immediate. A 40-year-old actor, a member of one of Hollywood's most famous families, found dead in his Santa Monica condo. The assumption, given his public history of addiction and his visible weight gain, was clear and swift. It must have been an overdose. The media began to frame it as another sad, predictable Hollywood story of excess. The timing was particularly cruel. The Darwin Awards, the film he was set to support, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival the very next day. What should have been a celebration became a somber, impromptu memorial. The festival held the screening in celebration of his life and his work, a tragic, sudden end to a career that had been a roller coaster of high peaks and low valleys. His brother Sean Penn canceled all promotional activities for his own films to grieve and handle the funeral. The family was intensely private, but the public speculation was rampant. It wasn't until weeks later, in mid-February 2006, that the official autopsy report from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office told a different, more complex, and perhaps sadder story. The primary cause of death was not an overdose. It was nonspecific cardiomyopathy. In simple terms, his heart. He had a severe pre-existing heart condition. His heart muscle was diseased and dangerously enlarged, weighing an estimated 700 grams, nearly double the size of an average healthy male heart. The death was ultimately ruled an accident, but it was a perfect storm of lethal, contributing factors. His morbid obesity at over 300 pounds had put an incredible constant strain on his already weak heart. And the toxicology report did find drugs in his system. It was a combination of painkillers and sedatives, including promethazine with codeine, a powerful prescription cough syrup, Valium, morphine, and marijuana. The coroner concluded that this cocktail of legal and illegal substances, combined with his diseased heart and his extreme weight, was a stress his body simply could not take. His heart gave out. His brother Sean later spoke about the tragedy on Larry King Live. He didn't blame the drugs. His assessment was simpler and more direct. He believed Chris died because of his weight. "It's a piece of you, you know," Sean said, trying to describe the loss. "I'm one of three. I intermittently have lost my right arm, my left, or the center." So, what is the legacy Chris Penn leaves behind? It is not the simple legacy of a movie star. He was not his brother. He didn't have the leading man looks or the global fame. His is the legacy of a true character actor. And in that, he was one of the absolute best. With nearly 80 screen credits, he left behind a body of work that demonstrates a truly staggering range. He could be the sweetest, most lovable friend you'd ever want. He could be the most terrifying, ruthless monster you'd ever meet. And sometimes, as in the funeral, he could be both at the exact same time. He was admired by his peers for his instinctive, raw, and brutally honest style. He never seemed to be acting, he just was. He was a man who won one of acting's highest international honors, and he was a man who was unceremoniously cut out of a blockbuster teen comedy. He was a disciplined black belt, and he was a man consumed by his addictions. His story is a profound and profoundly sad what if. What if his daughter had lived? What if he had found a way to manage that unimaginable grief without the drugs? What if he had been able to get his health under control? What if he had lived to be 50 or 60? What if he had finally directed that Vietnam film, Nobody's Heroes, the passion project he had been working on since he was 18? We will never know. In the end, Chris Penn's life wasn't defined by the shadow he lived in, but by the indelible mark he left.